Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here this evening. This event is a part of Free Week, which is put on by X Marks the Arts and the Iowa City Downtown District. I work here at the library for the Iowa City Public Library Friends Foundation, but I'm also the co-chair of the X Marks the Arts initiative, which is a way of helping people understand what an incredible arts and cultural center that we have in our downtown area. So I hope you're also checking out some other free events this weekend and through the weekend. Lots of free stuff. There's a free concert at the Englert on Saturday night, among other things. And we wanted to make this event a part of Free Week to give it a little bit more exposure and also add a little something different to Free Week, because the library offers something a little different as it pertains to arts and culture. When I first got involved with arts and cultural activities in the downtown, a lot of people were only really thinking of literary events and music events and performances. And the library itself, which is the largest repository of books, over 500,000 books in our library, not everyone necessarily thought of it as a cultural institution, if that isn't interesting. So we've been doing a lot of work to connect some of those dots in terms of some of those marketing efforts. Tonight's event is really special. As the director of the Iowa City Public Library Friends Foundation, I look for opportunities to bring our community together here at the library and help bring people together around new ideas. And I made a goal this year of wanting to make sure that we did events with all different age groups. And so this is our event that we're working with teenagers on this event, and the Roots and Shoots Club from City High School. And this event came together because for a number of reasons. I was at the Iowa Library Association conference in Sioux City, and they were giving us a tour of this beautiful historic theater where the conference was taking place, and I was with all my library colleagues. And the person giving us a tour said, oh, and here's where Jane Goodall signed the wall. And then everybody hung their heads because it was the day that Jane Goodall had passed away. And we had a little somber moment, and everyone talked about how much Jane meant to them. And all of a sudden the dots connected in my head, and I said, oh my gosh, my friend Nora Cole met Jane Goodall when she came and spoke at this theater. And the woman who was giving us the tour said, is she the girl with the pink hair? She said, Jane, she received a gift from Nora, and I'm going to let Nora tell the story. She received a gift from Nora and then realized how badly she wanted to meet her and get to spend a little time with her. And then this wonderful woman from the theater hunted her down in Sioux City in order to make this happen. So Nora's going to tell you more about that. The other way that we're connecting some dots tonight is last year, Right House of Fashion had their very first Beyond Fashion Fest. So if this is an interesting subject to you, learning about fashion and all of the elements of that, this fashion festival might be for you. And they welcomed Luke last year as a speaker, and I went to that event. And to put it simply, it changed my life. It changed the way that I think about myself as a consumer. It changed the way I move through the world. I'm proud to say I thrifted this jacket for $3. I've always been a proud thrifter, but before I set out to buy something, I think, do I need it? And what is the best way that I can acquire this item where I have the least impact on the environment, right? Sometimes you luck out, and sometimes you have to try a little bit harder, or maybe spend a little bit more, or maybe try to connect some dots that you haven't connected before. So thank you for being here for this event tonight. I'm going to turn the microphone over to my friend Nora in just a moment, but I did want to just mention to everyone that it's been a really tough legislative session for libraries. And there has been a lot of extreme legislation introduced that would be very, very damaging to libraries. And so if you are interested in learning more and staying informed of what some of this legislation is and how it would affect libraries in Iowa, you can talk to me afterwards. I also have some information over there, and I'd be happy to fill you in. The funnel ends tomorrow, and we're hopeful that some of these damaging bills will not make it through. So thanks for letting me put that little tidbit in there. Nora, why don't you come on up? This is Nora Cole, everyone.
and founder of Roots and Suits City High. So I wanted to start off by talking about, so this is my table of contents. It's a short little lecture. So what is Roots and Shoots? You know, the hardest part actually about starting Roots and Shoots was trying to tell people about what it was. And it's a really special program that spans across the world. So Roots and Shoots was founded in 1991 after Jane Goodall wanted to expand her reach not only to other adults who already knew that they were passionate about the environment, but to the people who were going to control the world one day, the young people. She made it her life's mission to make sure that she was reaching out to all different types of age groups. So in Tanzania, the same place where she discovered that the tool use in apes, she started Roots and Shoots. She started with environmentalism, community work, and animal protection. And she encouraged teenagers to choose their own paths and what they wanted to do to change the environment, the community, or to protect the animals. And also, there's programs in 75 plus countries in all 50 states. So I wanted to talk about especially meeting Jane Goodall because this past fall was really rough for the program at City High because it was not only hard to see someone that I had looked up to my whole life pass away, but also someone that I had met myself. And I think that this story is just such a wonderful tribute to how she was kind to everyone, and she really gave people a chance to get to know her, even when it wasn't planned. So it was in the March of 2025, and I was going up to see her speak. I was so excited to see her speak because as a young child, I've always wanted to do conservation work throughout my life. I'm really interested in entomology, especially insects, and I want to make my impact by helping insects around the world. And so I thought it would be really great to see one of my biggest heroes speak. So I went with not the intention to meet her, but to see one of my biggest heroes. And I happened to bring a zine called You, Why We Dislike Insects, in the hopes that perhaps I could share it with her because it was a work of art that I had put together and that really spoke to my passion about insects and my desire to have a conservation program at some point in my life. And I, luckily enough, stayed around after the lecture, even though they said that they wouldn't meet anyone, they weren't signing anything, that I went up to the stage and I gave her one of the zines. Well, one of her associates, because she had gone behind stage. At this point, she was 91 years old and probably quite fragile, and they probably didn't want a lot of people swarming her, especially since she's such a famous figure to so many people. So I was lucky enough that she read the zine, and I was invited backstage and I got to meet her. She was just, a lot of people say not to meet your heroes, but Jane Goodall is definitely the exception. When I went into her little room, she was holding a glass of whiskey in one hand and my zine in the other. And I sat down next to her and she asked me about myself. I barely asked her any questions, and it seemed as though she really wanted to get to know me. And at the end, she said, Nora, you have to start a Jane Goodall Roots and Shoots program at your school, and you should become an insect conservationist and make that happen in your life. And of course, you can't say no to Jane Goodall, so I decided to start the Roots and Shoots program. So I'd like to share with you some different seasonal things that Roots and Shoots has done so far and some of our plans for the future. So this was when we were just starting off in spring. We were really lucky that we started after spring break and that there was a lot of plant life and all that kind of stuff. So we started off with studying the early spring ephemerals. We did flower pressings and things like that. We started with making zines. We also went morel mushroom hunting, and we studied different aspects of forest conservation. You can see on the middle photo on the bottom the impact of that emerald ash borer, and so we talked about things like that and how you would continue to conserve the forests. And we also went to go see another lecture, which was really inspiring, by the author who authored Braiding Sweetgrass, and it was wonderful to go see her. And we actually ended up meeting her at the end of the night too, which was wonderful. And over the summer, we had a program for students to come out to Friendly Farm and volunteer there. Every other week, we would do either art or we would help them on the farm, which was really fun. For our fall and winter, this last year, school year, we went chicken of the woods mushroom hunting, and we found an absolute harvest, and we practiced make sure you don't take all the mushrooms, even though you desperately want to. So we took only about 1/8 of the mushrooms, despite the beautiful harvest that there was. We also had a bake sale, which we raised almost $400, which was $200 over our goal, so that we can go to, I'll talk about this a little bit later, so we can go camping at the end of the year. We also have the Jane Goodall's Last Words film party, which was made after she passed away, which was wonderful. And then we also went out to the Friendly Farm again to gather more tomatoes and to donate them to the shelter. So future plans for Roots and Shoots. So our 3 big programs that we want to continue focusing on is we want to have a Seed Savers. We're going to go up to Seed Savers in Decorah and do a weekend-long camping trip so we can learn about sustainable farming, which we're really excited about. And since we made so much more than what we were expecting, because the $200 was meant for that camping trip, we're deciding to make donated care packages for the unhoused in Iowa City. And additionally, we will also have the same program at Friendly Farm this year. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nora. To keep us on schedule, I'll keep my comment brief, but I already said that this was a life-changing program for me that I got to see last year, and I'm really excited for all of you. We are going to leave a little bit of time at the end for questions, and Nora will be running this microphone around. It is important when we do a Q&A that we hear the questions on the microphone, because there's people watching online, and this is also taped and put on the library's YouTube channel. So that way everybody listening at home gets to hear all the information. So let's welcome Luke.
And no pressure, because I'm supposed to change your life, so I don't know about that. Let's see here. That's faster. Okay. Can you hear me okay? All right. A little bit louder. Okay. So I'm Luke. And yeah, I grew up on a farm in Iowa, and then I came to Iowa City, and I was fortunate. If I communicate well tonight, it's because Zepha's mom taught me that. But anyway, I came here to the University of Iowa to get a PhD in chemistry with Dr. John Aletti, and learned a lot of science and a lot of things, and went off to be a chemistry professor and then became an accidental entrepreneur. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that and about what I was interested in. And then, you know, we all sort of stand on the shoulders of giants. And I thought it'd be fitting just to, like, I don't need to read this slide to you because you can all do that yourself. But I hope maybe this is a good framing for what I'm going to talk about tonight. You know, our interconnectedness. In other words, our impact is our interconnectedness. And as people who plan the future, we have a role to play in all that. And hopefully, as we do that, we think about that as individuals. We think about that as members of communities, as members of cities and counties and states and countries and things like that. Not just individuals, but it all, many layers to it, right? Okay, so be thinking about that stuff, I guess, as we go through. All right, so you've probably already made your judgments on me and my fashion. So I'm not here to make any wild claims about what's fashionable or not fashion. I'm a scientist, pretty practical guy. What I'm going to talk about is where a lot of the materials that we use for our everyday stuff, and fashion's a really important kind of everyday thing that we do. I'm going to talk about where those materials come from and what the consequences of that are, what is the interconnectedness of all of that stuff. And maybe the other thing I'll say right now is, you know, in order to solve anything, you first have to very carefully define the problem. So what I'm going to take you through here is some things that I observed and kind of like was thinking a lot about towards like how do you really carefully define a problem so that you have a chance of solving it. Anyway, we'll talk more about that. Okay, so we live in this world where we go to the store and we buy stuff. And when we buy stuff, and we're going to focus on clothes today, but you could think about other stuff you buy too. When you buy stuff like shoes or pants, and I've got, by the way, examples here we'll talk about a little later of stuff that is completely free from plastic. It doesn't have any plastic in it, which you'd be like, well, is that really that hard? And it turns out, yeah, it is. If you kind of think about what you're wearing or what you're sitting on or the carpet, anyway, plastics are ubiquitous and everywhere. And you could ask yourself, where does plastic come from? Can anyone see this red little dot? It's a very small little red dot. But plastics, generally speaking, they come from fossil fuels. Now, it's true that there's something called bioplastics, but I'll just say bioplastics, they matter, but for the sake of what we're talking about tonight, they really don't, because something like, of all the plastics that are made, it's like 99% of it is fossil fuel-based plastic. So again, if we think about defining the problem here, we should all ask ourselves, could bioplastics actually be a solution to plastics? Well, I'll say it's kind of tough to think that, because we've had bioplastics actually for quite a while, and they're still like a very, very tiny statistical fraction of what we use. So we have to kind of think about like why that is and what might be the right solution. But okay, so there's an issue where plastics come from, how they're actually produced with chemistry. Then we mix plastics together to make objects. One of the reasons why recycling is so difficult is because whatever you're wearing typically is a mixture of plastics that can't be unmixed at the end of life. And we all take it for granted, but like, if you could grind up plastics or grind up our trash and scatter it on farmers' fields as fertilizer, we would probably do that, right? Except we can't. So why don't we? Well, it's because they're toxic. So when we're wearing plastics, it turns out that when we wash our clothes, or even when we're just wearing our clothes, we're shedding micro and nano plastic into our environment. So we're eating this stuff, we're breathing this stuff, we're drinking this stuff. And if it weren't for the fact, if plastics were inert, that would be okay, or I don't know, it would be less bad, but they're not inert. So plastics are mixtures of complex toxic stuff. We'll talk about that. And then there's, you know, what happens to things at the end of life. So this is kind of like the system that we have. So again, towards defining the problem, and by the way, this is done at a scale that's kind of phenomenally large. It's there's tens of trillions of dollars invested in the infrastructure that digs fossil resources up from the ground and pipes it all over and does chemistry and not just powers our cars, but makes plastics. So when I talk about tens of trillions, I mean, that's kind of like, what does that even mean? Well, I don't know, what is it? The U.S. gross domestic product is something like, what, 25 trillion per year or something? So we're talking about like really, really huge amounts of wealth would be one word I could use, or sunk costs are in having this stuff and being able to do it at the scale of billions of people. So if we're going to have an impact on that, or if we're going to like break free of our impact from doing that a lot, then we're going to have to, I don't know, we're going to have some constraints to what the solution might look like. All right, so we have this thing that's fundamentally extractive. So we like to use words in the world today, regenerative or recycle, but this is like fundamentally extractive. Fundamentally, all you're doing is pulling things out of the ground. And then what are we putting it back into the environment or the ground as? Well, anyway, this stuff. What are we releasing while we do it? This not so great stuff. So what we want to do is figure out, like, if I'm going to be a responsible citizen as a chemist or as a consumer, what do I have to be aware of to make informed choices that might be better than the ones I would make if I wasn't so aware? All right, so plastics are the most expensive material humans have ever made. And that goes back to that stat I was saying before. If you think about all of the sunk cost of petrochemicals, if there was somehow some alternative universe, so let's do a quick thought experiment. If there was somehow some alternative universe where plastics had not been invented, and then along came some chemist and said, I've got this great idea, one word. There's so many young people around here, but plastics, yes. The graduate, right? You wouldn't be able to create a company to get plastics into the world today. Because if you had to start by first having, digging up oil and spending, hundreds of millions of dollars per oil rig out in the Gulf of Mexico with hundreds of $1 million ships coming up to those, or hundreds of millions of dollars of pipelines with hundreds of millions of dollars just to make a single large-scale refinery. Okay, when you're talking hundreds of millions and then you've got thousands of these things and that's how you get to trillions of dollars worth of stuff when you apply that across, it's not just happening in America, it's happening everywhere and all the time right now. All right, and the base material into plastic is that stuff. So even before you can make a plastic, you have to get all these raw materials, do all this chemistry on this stuff. Then you can make fiber. Then you've got trillions of dollars yet invested in knitting machines and sewing machines and infrastructure that spins yarn and does all sorts of stuff that can make fabrics that can make fashion possible, make our clothes. All right, so it's just a really hard problem if you think about it, because it's super expensive if you think about all this. If plastics were a country, then it's like the GDP of plastics per year is anyway, it's bigger than India. So here's the big, these are older stats, 2019, so all these numbers have gotten a little bit bigger in time, but it's kind of crazy if you think about it. Plastics, if it were a country and you were just totaling up the cost of all the economic activity that's going on, getting the oil, transforming it, et cetera. Anyway, it's trillions of dollars per year. It's kind of crazy. So I'm arguing, I guess it's a very big, ingrained kind of a problem to think about. And it's the most dangerous material people, okay, that one you could debate with me. By the way, if anyone wants to debate long after the talk tonight, I'll stick around later. We have a time limit on all this, I know, but dangerous. When I say dangerous, I guess I'm gonna make the case for they're pretty dangerous. Are they more dangerous than something that's horribly, radioactive or something? I'm not. Whatever. We can all talk about what's the most dangerous thing. So I'm not trying to make anything more of it than what it is. But let's just talk about shape and chemistry right now. So who's heard of asbestos? Asbestos. So that's bad. Do you know that asbestos is chemically inert? Anyway, asbestos is just a mineral. What makes asbestos toxic is its shape. It's really, really tiny little needle-like shapes that if you breathe it into your lungs, it pokes holes in your cell walls in your lungs and anyway, can do damage that way. So that's an example of being toxic by shape, and plastics can do that. So plastics don't break down in the environment. They're not natural. Generally speaking, there aren't creatures out there that eat plastics. Now, there are news articles you can read that say worms or different things can eat plastics, and that's true, but they're not, plastics are so recent in history, there's really not a natural way right now to really take care of the problem that happens when you have tiny little pieces of plastic that break off. So they're getting in your lungs and they're not breaking down, and then they have the shapes. Many of these things, the little fibers you can imagine, are very needle-like, and they could have shapes that are an awful like things like asbestos. And then there's chemistry. So in order to make plastics work, plastics don't just work for us when we wear them. Plastics have to work when they go through the manufacturing process. So when you make plastics, there's stuff added to the recipe that are molecular shapes, for example, that allow the plastics to flow. And one of the things the plastic industry has done is they have found shapes that make plastics flow, yes, on one hand. On the other hand, unfortunately, those shapes are the same shapes as, say, estrogen. So all of us right now are getting dosed with synthetic, whether we like it or not, because even if I'm wearing plastic-free stuff today, I'm in an environment where other people are shedding this stuff, and I'm getting dosed with a certain amount of synthetic estrogen, basically. And we'll talk more about that. That's like a really, the science is starting to, learn what that means. And there's a lot of concern about all that stuff. So anyway, there's a ton of science that's going on, particularly in the last 10, 15 years, about this kind of monstrosity that we've unleashed on ourselves without ever really thinking about what the consequences of that would be. And anyway, the evidence is not good. And maybe I'll say one other thing with this slide and I'll move on. If you think about, like, if I have an egg or something like that, I have to work. There's a lot of different ways I can break an egg. And then there's only one way I can put it back together, if I even can. All right? So think about this problem as something like that. Like, entropy is not our friend when it comes to unleashing this kind of stuff without any thought at the scale of $3-4 trillion per year of it all over planet Earth. Oh, and by the way, we formulated a whole bunch of it with synthetic molecules that look a lot like estrogen. What could go wrong? All right, so, and again, the key thing is if it's in the air and the water and the soil and our food at this point, then it's prevalent in us, and that's an issue. So, and I think I said this before, so there's a lot of people who have thought about, well, could we just put the right filters on wash machines? So here, I'm gonna take you through a thought process of thinking about that. Like, let's for the moment, let's just ignore the fact that at least half of your clothes, when your clothes lose weight over time, when you wear them, then they're losing weight because you're either shedding or some of the materials washing away while you wash your clothes. Typically, a t-shirt, let's say, will lose about 1 to 2% of its weight when you wear it, say, by the 40th, 50th time, something like that. And you see lint in the trap of your dryer, but that means that there's things that went down the drain. That also means that there's things that went into the air even before you put it into the washer or the dryer. All right, but if we talk about washing machines, anyone want to guess about how many wash machines are on planet Earth that people have right now? What do you think?
1 billion.
Awesome guess. That's right. I mean, generally within margin of error, that's exactly right. There's about 1 billion wash machines employed by people. And let's say you had a solution, you came up with an awesome idea that would only cost $100, let's say, to not only make a special filter for a wash machine and overcome some of the things that you might have to do when you think about, like, extra stress on pumps and water flow and all. But let's say you could make something for a wash machine and get it installed, because remember, these 1 billion wash machines are all over the planet. You have to send repair people out, and they're gonna have to spend some time installing this. So I don't know, $100, that seemed like a reasonable assumption. Someone could argue with me, no, it's more like $500. Anyway, back of the envelope kind of math here. If I have $100 per wash machine and 1 billion wash machines, we can all do the math. How much money is that to put? Who's got that money sitting around, right? Who's gonna, like, you see, again, what this problem kind of is. And then even if you could do all that, we're still left with, like, we shed microfiber when we put things in the dryer and when we wear it. So that doesn't actually fundamentally solve the problem. So it's a good example of, like, you see things in the news sometimes, oh, there's these great solutions, but is it a local solution? Is it kind of a local thing, or is it the global minimum or maximum that we're looking for to solve for? All right, so again, polyester, imagine this is the amount of polyester, let's say, in that jacket, okay? And over the course of wearing that jacket, say a few dozen times, that much polyester microfiber is going to be released. And we could have further broke that little dot down into, you know, the amount that's into the air, or the amount that's into the water, et cetera, if you want to. But for right now, we won't pay too much attention where it's going. We'll just say that's about 1/100th the size of the circle. Okay, so I'm trying to visually kind of show the math here. So this circle is 1% the size. It'd take 100 of these to make that circle. Okay, so that's great, except that now if I just renormalize and say that we produce about 45 billion pounds, it's about 120, I think it's like 115, 120 billion pounds. I was in kilograms, sorry, 45 billion kilograms, but times 2.2 is, anyway, it's an older number, I guess. We're pushing way past 100 billion pounds per year of polyester. Polyester, by the way, is the fiber, or is the polymer that goes into soda bottles and water bottles and cups and into our clothes. Anyone want to guess, from a ratio perspective, for every pound of plastic cups and bottles of polyester made, how many pounds do you think of clothes or textiles are made? Anyone want to dare guess?
5 pounds of clothing for 1 pound of water bottle.
Close, a little less than that. So so the answer is 2 to 1. So for every pound of plastic bottles there's out there, that, you know, those kinds of uses, there's about 2 pounds worth of fabrics that are made from polyester. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, because we see all the litter of bottles. But okay, clothes is a big thing, and I'm sure people have seen those, you know, those images. Really, I didn't put a bunch of, like, really decrepit pictures in here of, like, what goes on when our old clothes go to Africa and places like that, or South America. There's some really, really terrible stuff. But so now, though, if this circle represents, so same circles, but now, and the ratios are still the same, right? But now what we're going to say is, this is like global polyester, and global how much is getting, and now what you find is that circle weighs as much as a transit bus. So daily, what we're doing is we're dumping like dozens of fully loaded transit buses worth of microfiber and nanofiber into the environment, into the oceans, every day. So that's a thing. And then again, the science is not really good on that. There's again, because there are these chemistries. You know, our bodies are very, very complex. Our biochemistry is very complex, and you don't need very much of a hormone to affect who you are and how you behave and how you think and all sorts of things. So if you start thinking about messing with that chemistry, you don't actually need that much of a synthetic dose of some of this other stuff to start affecting people not only when we're adults, but affecting people when they're, you know, gestating in mom, etc. And there's a lot of stuff. I'm not going to go into all of this here, but again, you'll see, like, things when we're talking about fertility, we're talking about things that have to do with chemistry. When we're talking about strokes and heart attacks, we're talking about aggregation of blood clots around bits of plastic in your blood, in your brain. When we're talking about Alzheimer's and dementia and certain observations people are making. And by the way, these observations don't, you know, correlation and causation aren't the same thing, so we'd have to unpackage a lot to say what people scientifically can know at this point in time versus what we're observing and trying to untangle and make sense of it all. There's a lot there. I'm not going to go into all of it. We talk a lot about it, either in the questions or after. But right now, what we can just say is there are very powerful certain kinds of links between all the things that kill people or affect their lives in really remarkable, not great ways, and what we're wearing. So what do we do? Have I depressed everybody enough? All right, so now let's talk about, so it's this really big problem, and it's sort of endemic. It's everywhere. It's going to cost a lot of money to fix it, maybe. So we're going to have to, there's not enough philanthropy in the world that can solve a problem like this. So we're actually going to have to do better business to solve a problem like this. Anyway, what would the alternative look like? So what would the answer to the plastic problem kind of look like? I want to take you through a thought process for how you might think about what the solution ought to be. So safe, right? Like we talked about toxicity. I guess we need to know what non-toxic means. Non-toxic by chemistry, non-toxic by shapes. It has to be, when I say low cost, I mean you can't be building tens of trillions of dollars of new infrastructure next year. Like, in other words, we can't stop 20 plus trillion dollars of GDP in America. Everyone stop what you're doing, because Luke said so. And no, you can't do your normal job. We're all going to get busy building some other alternative infrastructure, and it's going to take a whole year. None of us can eat, and we have to stop all economic. So that doesn't work, right? So this has to fit into our economy and how we do stuff. So those are like really hard constraints. We need non-toxic, abundant inputs. When I say easy to make, I mean it has to fit business-wise and logistics-wise into supply chain and a lot of the sunk costs of trillions of dollars of stuff we already have. If it doesn't fit those constraints, it's just not going to happen. And then ideally, you do some other good stuff along the way too. And here's the really persnickety thing. We don't want any unintended new problems. Like some people have invented bioplastics that turn out that don't really degrade the way that you'd like them to, and then they're toxic by their shape, and okay, you didn't really solve the problem. If I go back to the wash machines, I could put filters on things and say, oh, I solved them, but did I? Because now people kind of think the problem is solved, but it's not solved at all. Right? All right, and we don't want new unintended problems of any sort. So here's what a kid who got to grow up in Iowa started thinking about. And that's that when you look in nature, like, what do you see? You see fallen trees. You see all sorts of stuff in this picture. And we all take it for granted that nature doesn't waste anything. It recycles nutrients, right? It knows how to break this tree down. By the way, this tree that fell, it could take 100 years. But by certain people's rules on breaking materials down, trees are no longer, you can't call them biodegradable anymore. Except that you can, of course, if you grind this tree up into sawdust, you can just scatter it and forget about it. And it's not toxic because it's cellulose and lignin and hemicellulose and proteins. So it's made of sugar, in other words, and amino acids and the stuff of life. So anyway, what we have all around us is the garden, and of course, people like Jane Goodall have made us all aware of like how important it is to live in symbiosis with all of that. So let's think a little bit more about along that line. So plants are the only infrastructure, I would say, that people have that could solve this problem. I can't think of anything. I've tried. Tried to think a lot of other things. There's been people working hard on, how do you get certain kinds of nuclear, like, how do you harness the power of the sun, right? Well, plants do all this stuff already. And by the way, plants are like, they grow at a scale that's kind of hard to believe. So remember, over 100 billion pounds of polyester per year. And here's nylon and acrylic and spandex. These are like the major components that go into making all the synthetic side of our fashion. And then we grow a lot of cotton, and we cut down some trees to make something called rayon, which is not actually a great chemistry process. And then there's wool and silk and linen. But this is the 400 or so billion, not quite, let's say 200 billion pounds-ish worth of stuff, worth of raw materials that go into making trillions of dollars of fashion per year. Okay? And again, the size of the circles is related to the amount that we make in a year. This dotted line, which goes all the way around this building, that is the amount of cellulose. That's nature's most abundant polymer. When we eat it, we call it fiber. When we wear it in the form of cotton, cotton is cellulose, generally speaking. But that's the amount of cellulose that grows on planet Earth each year. 100 gigatons, 100 billion tons. It's phenomenal. Sunlight to make sugar. And if you took just 1% of it, because it's hard to visualize a circle, right? So I took this circle and I took 1% of it, and that's 1 gigaton on this scale. So, okay, plants fits the criteria of being way more abundant than we need it to be. We're not, in other words, we don't have to cut down every tree. In fact, grass clippings and all sorts of things, if you think about how you're going to formulate now with this stuff, you think about plants as ingredients. We're solving the abundant part of that slide we were talking about earlier. Okay, so, okay, we're on the right track on abundance. By the way, we got lots of waste cotton sitting in our closets right now. Old blue jeans, or do I dare take the poll? Who has more than 5 pairs of blue jeans? I do. Okay, not everybody. Okay, that's good. Well, maybe blue jeans went out of style. I don't know. Anyway, these are cotton too. Okay, oops. I digress. Sorry. I'll say there's a lot of materials too where we don't have to have virgin materials necessarily to make the stuff we need. If we could collect it, get it in the right forms. When we design clothes that are monolithic with material, then it's easier to recycle them. That means you have to do really hard things, like there are people in this audience I know that Juki sewing machines have to operate at 5,500 RPM to be efficient from a cost perspective, from an operational perspective. When you're operating Juki sewing machines at 5,500 RPM, a lot of times what people will do is they'll have a cotton t-shirt that's sewed together with polyester. You see what the problem is? Now you have like 99% of the shirt is biodegradable, but now the 1%, that's the polyester sewing thread, is this toxic stuff that if you threw that in your garden, you wouldn't want polyester stuff in your soil. So, okay, so there's like these persnickety things in how we design that end up people have to be educated about and be able to do. All right, here's another. Now we're going to talk about cost effective. So have I convinced you all that plants might be a good idea? Yeah. Good. I would have been in trouble if I hadn't done that. All right, so now what we're going to talk about is cost effective. And here's again polyester and cotton. And now I'm going to put it in the context of its utility versus its cost per kilogram. Okay, and this scale isn't perfect, but and this is a logarithmic scale, so that means I'm not going to count by ones. I'm going to count by a number, single-digit number to numbers with 2 digits to numbers with 3 digits, 4 digits. Okay, so in order to make fashion work, and us, some people can afford Gucci and Hermes and all this stuff. That I got to go see some of that stuff in Paris a number of different times, but I can't afford that stuff, and most people cannot afford that stuff. So what I'm talking about here is the mainline stuff that we buy at the Coral Ridge Mall, or maybe even downtown for a little bit more at any number of shops. And polyester has a little bit more, this is an arbitrary scale, but I'm going to argue here that polyester has a little more utility, and it's a little less expensive. And those two economic drivers are why we have so much polyester use in the world. Okay? Okay, cotton's not a perfect crop, by the way, and we talked about other things too. Here's the rest of that lineup of stuff. And what we want to do, if we think about a cost-effective solution, we would want stuff that has, well, ideally it'd be really low cost, so it'd be over here, and it would have really high utility. But you all know that if stuff actually existed up here, we'd already be using it, right? That's kind of like a law of economics. Like if you can have less expensive stuff to make your stuff with, then the manufacturers are going to, of course, use that. So there isn't really stuff up here. There is low value, low utility stuff like cotton waste that happens in a year or something. And what we'd want to do is figure out, like, and here's that cotton waste available that could be recycled, but what we'd have to do is like figure out how to formulate with it in ways that move it up in utility so it can compete without changing its cost so much that it gets too expensive to use. So in other words, if you notice, these circles are smaller. Why are these circles smaller? Well, if you could produce so much more silk, you probably would, but we can't because it's expensive, right? So there's a bunch of embedded economic sort of stuff that's in this. Why I put this here. So, you know, there's a lot of cellulosics like flax. There's a lot of plants basically here, is what I want to alert you to. And so it turns out plants, because they're so abundant, they're also low cost. And so they kind of fit the criteria. So then what we have to do is figure out how to formulate with it. As opposed to, like, this is some really cool stuff. There's some people that have been trying to make biosynthetic silk and petri dish leather and all kinds of stuff. The problem is, do you see what the problem is, though, with this graph? Like why a lot of biotech can't work? Like if you want to ferment some new material, you're left with a cost function that's like horribly broken. So none of us can afford t-shirts that are like $1,000 a t-shirt. Just won't work. I don't know, legislatively, we could make it harder and harder to buy t-shirts or something, but you know, like there's limits to like what we can do here. All right, so there are some, and these things, when you look at the cost function of how they get less expensive, they just don't. That's, you know, talk technology-wise, why I say that. I don't have the time to unpackage that all right now, but this is true. So what we need to do is we need to work on how do we take this stuff or this stuff and use it in this kind of cost band and get a lot of utility out of it. And how do we do that in ways that then encourage people who grow plants to do it in the right ways that don't like put too much fertilizer on, or, you know, this is an example of what's called regenerative farming, where you don't till the soil and you have cover crops and things to not have erosion. You don't want to compete with food, right? We want to keep feeding people for the right price, but not mess with people's food supply. Okay, one last like fact. By the way, how am I doing for time again? We're going to, oh gosh. All right, awesome. We'll have lots of time for questions yet. All right, good. All right, but I can take some time with this. This is kind of like an amazing thing. So again, petrochemicals, extractive, all kinds of other like problems that happen every once in a while that show up in the news. Farming, not perfect. There's a lot of like rules around farming that we could talk about that matter a lot in this context to have a truly regenerative. But for right now, I'm just going to say plants are the only thing that's abundant, cost effective, has a chance at having the right utility. We're going to have to make sure not to have the unintended consequence of like wrecking our food supply or something like that. So, you know, all that stuff can be done. One more thing, and we'd like to have some positive benefits with all of this. So this is an amazing graph, and the fact, you know, that it's free on Wikipedia and it's just sitting there for anybody is kind of interesting. So this shows carbon dioxide in the atmosphere measured at Mount Moloa in Hawaii from about 1960 to, I don't know, this like goes to 2020 or something like that, so pretty close to. And what you see is the blue line here is the average. We've just been adding carbon dioxide into the atmosphere year by year, about 2 parts per million of additional carbon dioxide in the atmosphere every year. Okay, Not going to go into all of the, the science of what's in our atmosphere. I'm just going to take it for granted that, when humans change something from 320 parts per million all the way to 420 parts plus per million, okay, and this is not volcanoes. This is like, anyway, the isotopic analysis of where this stuff is coming from is complex, but it's well understood. This is people doing this, all right? But there's this amazing thing, which is that there's actually a cycle here. It's a yearly cycle, and here's just zooming into this yearly cycle. Now, remember, we're adding 2 parts per million per year, and yet from April until August, look at this, we lose like 5, 6 parts per million, not quite 6, so let's call it 5, 5.5 parts per million, as measured at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, of carbon dioxide leaves the atmosphere temporarily. So like multiple years worth of people emissions that are net. Isn't that crazy? So what is that? Plants. Here it is. People have satellites, and we can do what's called standoff spectroscopy, and we can look at a number of things at the same time. We can look at both where the plants are growing and when it's winter time versus summertime. So I'm going to go back and show this again. And when the plants are growing here, carbon dioxide concentration is low in South America. The northern hemisphere has the majority of the land mass, right, to do agriculture. We live in a part of the world that is like a gargantuan engine of photosynthetic, just sucking carbon out of the atmosphere like no human technology can do. It's unbelievable when you think about the numbers and the scale and the fact that it's all solar driven, it's non-toxic fundamentally, and it's making polymers that are even better than the synthetic ones that we make in many cases. So in other words, if we do our agriculture right, we're going to get, and that's what's so important about this picture right here, is when you don't disturb the soil, there's this amazing thing that happens in the soil with different bacteria and things like that sinks the carbon in the soil and makes more soil. So carbon can be durably sunk in soil. In fact, again, we live on what used to be a prairie. It had topsoil really, really thick. Where did all that come from? Carbon out of the atmosphere, cycle after cycle, year after year, hundreds of years, thousands of years, tens of thousands of years. Building that up, what was the prairie grass doing? Holding that soil in place, right? So that could build. All right, so people can do that again by engineering our farming and doing this kind of stuff while we grow our food and while we grow our clothes. All right, so there we are. You can't ever 100%, like, you always got to keep your eyes open, right, for unintended consequences of things. But anyway, now we have to solve one more thing. So it all sounded really good, right? Hopefully. Now, there's one more thing, easy to make. Okay, gosh. Because you could all say, hey, Luke, great talk, clap. Where can I buy this stuff? And I'd say, oh, okay, let's talk about what people have to do. So, all right. So there's some things that technology and manufacturing is really good for us and will work for us to try to solve this manufacturing problem. So let me be really clear. What I'm telling you all is I think we've got like the boxes checked on 4 out of 5 important things. But what I haven't yet done a good job of explaining is how you would get this to work in places like Vietnam, where factories like, we're talking factories that are like 3 city blocks is just one building, and then you've got building by building, but like all of Iowa City is a factory kind of a thing. Like that's how big of scale fashion happens in Southeast Asia. So we're going to need to run our plants, not plastic system in factories like that because we can't rebuild all those factories. easily, not tomorrow, not next year. All right, and then, so what we have to do is think about like manufacturing ideas that have leverage. We all, have phones and things in our pockets, and there's this revolution happening around us right now with that stuff in your pocket is connected to data center, like all kinds of stuff that is pretty phenomenal, and it all has to do with taking switches that are as big as you can hold in your hand and making the switches so small that you can put literally billions and billions of them into a little wafer of silicon. And so there was this idea that back in the 1960s, there was this way of making switches, and there was a phenomenal idea that came out, which is called lithography, photolithography, which basically obsoleted, except for people who really love like certain kinds of like audiophile type equipment or something like that. This is obsolete, but making switches smaller revolutionized the world. So real simple way to say this statement, what was the problem? Well, you couldn't make switches low enough cost and switch fast enough and take low enough power. And so what do? You make the switch smaller. And then it turns out there was a particular idea about how to make the switch smaller that also lets you mass produce the switches in ways that are just, again, kind of outside your normal everyday intuition about what people can actually do. Less is more. So we're going to talk about a less is more approach. The best chemists I know are all women. My mom and grandma, I still have a living grandma. She's 103. But they have always in my life taken wholesome ingredients and put it together in recipes, and then they use this infrastructure called a kitchen, where you got different ways of adding heat, different way, right? You either heat with an oven or heat with a frying pan, and you can put and the order of addition of things matters, right? And sometimes you got to do something and let it sit for a day, and then come over here and do this. So, okay, there's a lot of complexity that goes on here, but I think there's a lot of like, well, what I was thinking about as a chemistry professor not so long ago was like, how would you take this scales in a really phenomenal way? And if I'm doing my gentle chemistry at food making type conditions, then I'm not going to be making certain kinds of byproducts that are nasty chemistry wise. And by the way, I want to use plants as inputs, right? So like, I don't know, think about how we do things. So it turns out that there's an analog. You can get natural rubber and hemp fiber and coconut husks and all sorts of things, recycled cotton. There's infrastructure in the world that already produces this stuff at really big quantities. So I don't have to start any companies, in other words, to like get a whole bunch of new ingredients. And then when you start looking at the infrastructure in the world that makes plastics, so this is a mixer. This called an internal intermesh mixer, and this kind of mixer mixes up all kinds of rubber compound. By the way, rubber, the vast majority of rubber is synthetic plastic. Although you can get natural rubber from trees, and it's actually better than the synthetic stuff. But this kind of mixer in the world mixes up plastic recipes all day long, all over the world right now. And it's just a big motor with a big kneading kind of a mixer in there. And then batches of plastics come off, and they go to equipment that smashes it flat, like a rolling pin, because what do you need flat plastics for? Well, sidings for houses, bottoms of shoes that need to get in their final stamp form. There's all kinds of stuff. It just goes on and on and on. And then there's roll-to-roll press and assembly, where you bake and you shape and you do stuff. Okay, so feels like a long time ago, but I started thinking about that and thinking about like, how could I think about this as a company kind of like idea, and not just have it be an idea though, like prove to people that this can work, because again, this has to fit into business. But if you believe this, like that there's already infrastructure that's kind of like a kitchen, and we just have to know how to formulate with this good stuff. And instead of putting toxic petrochemicals in the front end of this thing, we're gonna be really careful with our recipes and put natural ingredients. And we're gonna have to be really, really rigorous and really like firm that we're not gonna put just a little bit of neurotoxin in there, right? We have to be really careful about how we formulate from a chemistry perspective. But when we do, then we can get stuff that we need to make shoes and clothes and cars. And anyway, here's a pair of shoes that's completely free of petrochemicals and plastics. And what makes a pair of shoes like this is all these different materials are all formulated in this basic way, and then you can turn into a shoe. And then this shoe can do something that other shoes can't do, because the other shoes that have plastics, you can't grind them up and scatter them in a farmer's field, right? Because there's toxins in there. But when your shoes don't have any toxins, then they could go in the yard waste, and they could get ground up, and they could get scattered back into our lawns and our gardens and our fields. So think about, like, if you could consume that, how that would revolutionize a whole bunch of things. So that's what I thought we would do. So I founded a company called Natural Fiber Welding some time ago to prove that this could be true, and then we did. And the company is still active. It's in Peoria, Illinois. I'm in Iowa now. Our family moved to Iowa. But there are some really good people working really hard in a decent-sized building. Here's a baseball field for reference, and what we had in that building, for example, is equipment that is the same stuff that is like state-of-the-art that's in supply chain that was brought to Peoria, not because you're going to make everything, not that saying fashion now is only going to be in Peoria, right? Like, this is to prove that this is an industrial kitchen, basically, that proves that all of this works, and there's really no excuse for a bunch of people not to be adopting and using this stuff. And we have some products that we brought to market that are on the tables here. We can talk about that in the question and answers a little bit later. And we worked with a bunch of really big brands on bringing the products out so people could buy it, including car companies, etc. So it's doable. It's doable. And again, you can make complex things. What really matters, I can't stress enough, there's a whole recipe, say, behind a foam-like material here that's cork and natural rubber and some veggie oil and some, if you want to touch this later, you can smell it, and you smell the essential oils that are in it. And that's great. That can make a recipe for a foam, which you want to have the comfy part of your shoe for your heel strike, but then that's not going to be durable enough to stand up against the pavement. So then you need an all-natural, naturally cured rubber bottom for durability, and then you're going to need, I don't know, leather-like or fabrics or something for the top. You're going to need shoelaces that are going to be cellulosic. And you have to be really careful about on the shoelace, like the end here, this piece that we all take for granted, that we know it when our shoelaces don't have this piece at the end anymore. It's really hard to relace your shoes. So you got to make sure that's not plastic. And so I got to meet a bunch of really awesome people. This shoe is designed by a guy in the United Kingdom, and put those shoes on Prince William too. And then what's really special is when your shoe is made that way, then that is a grinder, and we just made dirt, not plastic waste. And some of those materials, by the way, when you grind it up that way, you can easily separate out the rubber components from the cellulosic components, and you can even recycle some of that plant material over and use it again. So that's what the company is working on doing then, is showing that this is all possible, that you can stay free from toxins, you can have various ways to return to earth, you can use materials again and again and get better utility so that we can keep more of the world wild, right? There's a whole thing here we could all point out, again, go back to Jane Goodall and point out we want to keep wild places wild to the extent that we can and that we should. And that's a big stewardship thing too. So that means we want to get these materials from the land that we already have into production, and ideally even get, as we get more efficient, put more and more land back to the wild. We can do that. And we can do that if we think about how do we live and formulate our chemistry for materials within what nature has already done. And then we came up with this idea of, well, we came up with the idea. We didn't come, nature already told us what this idea is. Start well, stay clean, end well. Do it rigorously. By the way, if you're going to end well, you can't just start well. You have to stay clean, right? I suppose you could think about this in any number of layers of life that we try to live, and none of us are perfect, but we do our best, and when we become aware that we've made certain kinds of mistakes, we try to figure out where those problems exist and holistically solve these things. Start well, stay clean, end well. Here's a model of a factory that was getting built in Vietnam when I started, and now this factory is operational. And the people that built this, anyway, I have phone calls with them once in a while, and we're working on how do they get some of the right infrastructure in these kinds of buildings. Again, football fields, and you can see how big these buildings are. How do we get this stuff running in ways that makes economic sense so that you can and I can all buy it at the Coral Ridge Mall or online or wherever we buy stuff. And that little company keeps on innovating. I don't think I'm going to, like, you can go to YouTube, YouTube, and you can type my name in or type in NFW and Earthshot Prize. I got to go to, anyway, meet Prince William in London and some other things because, anyway, there's a lot of good people working really hard to promote this kind of stuff, and you can watch that some other time. I think I'll stop there because we want to talk, right? Ask questions. So thanks for your attention.
I think this is turning on. There we go. I'm going to give the microphone over Nora so she can get the Q&A going. You guys, thanks so much for being here.
Hello. Does anyone have any questions?
How much are those shoes? The shoes that you showed, because I think one of the big problems is that there is so much cheap clothing out there that how can you convince somebody to invest in this? I mean,
Yeah. So that's a really good question.
You have to talk right in the front, right there.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I'll also repeat the question. So the question is, Luke, what about price? And then I'll say, and there's actually a couple of really good questions in there about price because, you know, price is a complex thing about what a shoe costs. So these shoes retail for like $140, so they're not the cheapest shoes.
Yeah. That's actually not bad at all. I'm surprised. I thought it would be a lot more, actually.
Here's the thing. So in order to prove this, I started a company where I lived at the time, which was Peoria, Illinois. But shoes typically are made in places like Vietnam at massive scale. So, and those factories also, the way they design and work, they have a particular kind of workflow that they do. So when you make small runs of shoes with materials that were made in Peoria and have to get shipped to Vietnam, and then they're not done in huge volume, and there's not a big giant company like Adidas behind it for marketing purposes, then yeah, I mean, it is kind of remarkable that the shoe, and thanks to everybody for like saying, anyway, Purified is the name of the brand, and I'm sure they'd all be really grateful to hear folks say like, good job for getting that price point, and it was a lot of work. The other thing though, people don't know is like, so as you know, when you start a company like this, there's everything you don't know, and there's we don't have time for this part of the story. Some other time. There's one guy there that knows, his name's Amos, that knows the whole Paul Harvey's rest of the story. But there's a really, really, the most hard problem I had to figure out, and I made a lot of mistakes, is how to be a human being and raise $250 million to have that kind of equipment and smart people and the time it takes to pay those engineers and chemists to like do this stuff and reduce it to practice and then interact with people all over the world. Anyway, that is one of the most brutal things. I didn't know that was going to happen to me. But yeah.
Try to influence people who do faster now to adapt your
Yeah.
job, I should say, to adapt.
Yeah, I got to go to imagine me dressed pretty much like this, showing up, I had a blazer on, showing up at Stella McCartney fashion show and Fashion Week, and like, talk about farm kid fish out of water, right? But there were horses rolling around in the ground while the models were, it was quite a circus. But yeah, I mean, do we try to influence? Yes, absolutely. Marketing fashion is like the original marketing, right? And the messages go out into the world at many different layers and levels. And I'll just say, and really in the end, what it requires is money and time and the right people being aware, so that these industries can adopt and change. But it's a big, complex set of industries, so it's not just like, oh, get the CEO of Adidas to agree with you and then it's fixed, right? Like shareholder meetings and all, like there's all the road blocking thing that has to do with big, giant, slow wheels of capitalism and capitalism isn't even the right word because it's a global economy that's a Frankenstein of different people's interests that ends up being a lot of hard influencing to have this stuff actually change the world, even though technically it all works. Yeah. Yeah.
So when was what was that? Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Okay. When was the shift, like inside of our society primarily, to plastics, like making clothes with plastic? Was it 1970s, 1980s, earlier?
Yeah, it sort of, it grew up like computers. So in the same way, like, and I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I'll say in the same time period that computers came along, if you think about like, I don't know, one of the first computers ever built was in Iowa State in Ames. It was a whole room. And then, I don't know, when did the first iPhone come out? Like in 2003 or 4 or 5, I don't know, something like that. And when did the first polyester leisure suit come out? Like the 70s. Then they were horribly uncomfortable and weeping all sorts of nasty chemistry stuff, and they worked a little bit to make it a little bit better, and then pretty soon you had polyester dresses, and they weren't as comfortable as cotton, and they still not. But there's been this progression towards fast. When did H&M and the Gap and all of this other stuff? Some of them have already come and gone, and some of them are still around. Like that's all kind of happened in the last like 40, 50 years, and infrastructure. Yeah, go ahead.
The Second World War brought out a lot of like rayon and nylon.
Yeah. There's a ton of mass production infrastructure. So the question was around, isn't it true that plastics predate all of that, and other processes of mass production? The answer is absolutely yes. The original Industrial Revolution was around machines, for example, that could spin cotton yarn and get rid of and comb out the seed and align the fiber and make yarn. So there's a very rich history, and it would be, well, I'm willing to stay here all night, but it would take me a long time to like really answer all of that at the right level of technical, economic, logistics, supply chain, et cetera, depth.
Well, I guess I was thinking about the fact that, like my parents, my dad talks about getting getting Levi's and putting on his Levi's and how hard they were, and getting in the bathtub with his jeans on to like soak them and soften the cotton. So I'm assuming, like, he would be in his 80s now.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that's 50s for him, maybe early 60s. And that, would there have been plastics in the clothes? Was it like economically advantageous to have it in the clothes at that time, or did it come later? And what was the point? Like, what was the shift that made it, oh, now it's cheaper?
The big shift, you know, again, I'm going to oversimplify, but the big shift about plastics is when the petrochemical industry started realizing that there's a lot more margin in churning oil into clothes than oil into just the stuff we burn. So, you know, anything that you're going to burn, by almost definition, has to be super cheap. So that industry, the chemists in that industry have been working really hard for a long time to add value, particularly to the stuff that can't be fuel and byproducts and things like that that come off of refineries, and turn that into, quote, useful stuff. And then, you know, like a lot of things, it's like Twinkies sounds like a good idea until like you find out what's really in a Twinkie. And if you start eating only Twinkies, then, right? So it's kind of like, that's what's happened with clothes. It's like, what happens when all you can eat is Twinkies, because that's all they know how to make out of a petrochemical refinery or something. So that's oversimplifying it and being a little bit crass, but you get the point.
In terms of the graph between utility and cost per
Sure.
kilogram, you did bring up silk and wool, but what about leather? Where would
Yeah.
that fall on that? I know it's about
great
plants,
question.
but that's a
Yep.
natural fiber.
So leather, so when people say leather, they think skins of animal, and then they may or may not know about tanning and how we make modern leather. Chromium, some other pretty nasty chemistries involved in that. And the fact that leather, because it is skin, it has actually, I mean, it does weather well, and it was formerly skin. So it is susceptible to abrasion. And so a lot of leather gets coated with something called polyurethane. And just like the wood floor in your house is coated with polyurethane. So polyurethane is a synthetic plastic that gets put on a lot of leather, especially in cars, to make it durable enough, to the point where then people figured out, you know, we can make flexible versions of polyurethane, and then we have what we call vegan leather, which is polyurethane, or acrylic, or even worse, PVC, polyvinyl chloride. And a lot of cars and things and bags and things have PVC. So, so it turns out that there's something like $200 billion per year worth of all that's called leather-like materials, of which, I don't know, 60, 70 billion dollars of it is what you might think of as like traditional leather that comes from cows, mostly cows and some pigs, a few sheep, but that's pretty much where all that comes from. And then there's a whole bunch of plastic. And the vast majority of cheap shoes, cheap wallets, cheap, really thin pants that are like look leather-like, that's all polyurethane.
So I just bought a new pair of jeans.
Yep.
I don't quite have 5 pairs of jeans yet with your question. In the write-up on the jeans, it said to make these jeans last a long time, try to wash them every 15 wears. And
Yeah.
I'd never seen anything like that before, and I thought, oh, that's really interesting. And then I started to think about how I've read, and you probably, this is what I would like you to expand on, that a lot of fast fashion, some of the clothing is designed for like 3 wears.
Yeah.
So could you
It's
just
crazy.
speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. You could imagine, I mean, it's a great question. So you could imagine a graph that's something like clothes have a utility, and that utility is some function of how many times you can wear it before you're going to throw it away, how many different kinds of events you can wear, like, you know, some stuff we only wear to weddings or something, but some stuff we wear every day. And yeah, and one of the very unfortunate things about how marketing has been put to a certain kind of purpose to part us with our money is that people, particularly young people, have been coached to believe that you should have a new kind of an outfit every season, or maybe multiple outfits, or shoes that match the outfit in particular ways that are fashionable. And okay, so what has happened is some of these large fashion brands have learned that the way to make money is to get the cheapest plastics, run them through the maximum automation, and or basically enslave people, pay them nothing, children, nothing, hide it, hide the industry and what's going on in various ways, and not talk about it, not let people talk about it. And that, but there's been people that documented that, and then be able to sell a garment for $12. And when you buy a garment for $12, then it's like a dopamine hit that then, oh well, it's only $12. I got like $36 in my pocket, so that means I can spend 12 more. Okay, so then that drives a volume of use, all predicated on cheap oil for cheap plastic, human labor that I'll just say is not scrupulous in many circumstances. And because it's so cheap, it makes you think it's just like a plastic bottle. How do I dispose of this thing? I don't know. Throw it out the window, or maybe I'll put it in the recycling bin. But so yeah, it is a monstrous problem. In fact, what also was happening was it was so cheap, they could sell it to you for 12, and then they could still put it on discount for 8. And if they don't sell it, well, then anyway, they can throw that away. It's cheap enough to throw some of it away, not even have to have the expectation to sell it all. So some of it doesn't get worn at all. And so, yeah, and why only 3 or 4 uses? Well, because it's so cheap, you can afford to buy another color if you want to. And, oh, by the way, the buttons are falling. We're not paying really close attention to the standards of that kind of clothing. And so the truth is the buttons do fall off after a couple of uses, or maybe even they're falling off on the way home from the store. And maybe you get around to taking it back, but maybe it's only $12. I'm just going to go buy another one. Like anyway, it feeds, you can see it feeds different kinds of vicious cycles of preying on people's behavior and preying on the fact that some of us in this world are privileged to have crazy amounts of disposable income. Because the amount of money that I get to spend feeding myself is so little. If I want to blow a bunch of money on fast fashion, when I say I'm not going to blame anybody here, but we're all to blame at some level. Okay, so the best thing we could possibly do too, someone could have said, hey Luke, I've got something better than your stupid talk, which is how about we just use the clothes we've got, like make high quality clothes, and use those clothes a really long time. And yeah, I'd say like that's a pretty darn good idea too. The only persnickety thing there is, anyway, business models and fashion and marketing are kind of at odds with that kind of thing. Now we live in this pluralistic place now where things that were cool when I was a kid are now cool again or something, or I don't know, they were cool and uncool and now got cool again, and then got like, maybe I'm old enough that we've been through a few cycles, but anyway, yeah, it's a human problem, not just a economic problem or a technical one. Yeah.
2 more questions, is that okay? Okay.
I'm here all night, folks.
I'm curious, you went for like cloth and clothing, but I'm also wondering if you ever looked into like asphalt or tires, kind of like
Yep.
the harder plastics.
Yes. So the answer is yes. Here's the issue with those. If you're gonna try to have impact, you can't do it everywhere all the time. And so I chose fashion because these are high value materials where people care. You just don't care about your asphalt the same way as you care about your shoes or something. And all of those like things like water bottles and those other kinds of plastics that are call them durable or semi-durable. Not only do people tend to not care and they go in products that end up being very disposable, therefore the margins for your business are like nothing. And the only way that that exists is because Dow and DuPont and like gargantuan companies have individually hundreds of billions of dollars worth of infrastructure and supply chain models to deliver that stuff to you for that price. So if you start your own company to try to compete with that, you're dead on arrival. And so some of those problems are really, really very difficult. I would say in those cases, for some of those examples that you're bringing up, the only hope of that getting better is going to be if the leadership of some of those companies that own those big markets, if they actually are willing to tell the truth and run their businesses in a different way. And then the problem is in these big markets, there's always like 2 or 3, the Pareto principle is in effect. I don't know if people know what the Pareto principle is, but basically any human game or any human market, you end up with basically, and this is true of music, it's true of like videos on YouTube, it's true of money, you end up always with people specializing in ways where basically all of the resources for that market are in the hands of like 1 or 2% of the people. Okay, and so you end up with with these markets that you're talking about too, where you have like 1 or 2 or 3, or sorry, not 1 or 2, it's usually 2 or 3 really big players that own the market. And if one of them decided to join the good side, so to speak, then they're at an economic disadvantage to the ones who are willing to do things the other. So we have that's where you have to have this like really important principle, I think. Now I'm going to wade into politics, but not all the way. I'll just say you need to live in this tension between if businesses are too big and the government and regulation is too small, then everything, all the power ends up here. And then, we've also seen what happens if governments are too much, and you have totalitarian things that don't necessarily. So we need to live in this balance where there is a healthy exchange of, and that's why we need books and people talking about this stuff, is like, what is the right tension to live within, where you've got some give and take on the regulation side about the impact of, say, an asphalt formulation that's going to be all over America, and whether or not it should have tires, by the way, that are full of 6 ppd, which 6 ppd, tiny, minute trace amounts of it in water kills salmon, a number of different kinds of salmon. Every time it rains in certain parts of the Pacific Northwest, little bits of the tires from our cars washes into the stream, and you have these giant kills of fish because 6 ppd is leaching out of the tire dust when it rains, and it rains at off the road and into the stream. So we got that takes science, that takes regulation, it takes companies and leadership doing the right thing and being transparent and willing to talk about when these problems come up, like that we address them. So it's an awesome question. I chose that stuff because it seemed like an easier problem to solve.
You guys, I think we're going to have to take any last questions after the end of the program, after we turned off the microphones. I want to thank you so much for presenting this incredible program. I want to thank Nora and the Roots and Shoots Club from City High School for sponsoring this program. And thank you for for taking the time to come out to your public library. This is our public library here in Iowa City. Every time you use it, you enrich it. Every time you come and check out a book, every time you come to a program, you make this place better and make it what it is. So thank you so much. I'm going to be over here with some materials that you can learn a little bit more about the foundation. Thanks again for being here, everybody.
Thank you.